Alright, go back to the previous question about the experiential function and elaborate me what these two assertions mean. So the first assertion is that the experiential function emphasizes the concept of style as choice, and the second assertion that the experiential function is an important marker of style, especially so of the style of the narrative discourse.
The experiential function in language refers to how language is used to convey experiences and perceptions. The first assertion means that the experiential function highlights how style in writing is a matter of choice. Writers select specific linguistic elements to express their experiences and ideas in particular ways. The second assertion suggests that the experiential function is crucial for defining the style of narrative discourse. It focuses on how narratives use language to represent experiences, and how this representation marks the narrative's distinctive style. In essence, both statements underscore that the experiential function plays a key role in shaping and reflecting an author's unique style in narrative texts.
Alright, so both of these assertions about the experiential function are true. Now, the next is to convey the communicative effect of the source. So let's discuss that question. So what's the correct answer to this question, and also elaborate this question a little further, and also try to exemplify what this really means.
To convey the communicative effect of the source means to accurately translate or express the intended message or impact of the original text in a new language. This process involves maintaining the same meaning, tone, and effect that the original text had on its audience. In translation, there are different approaches. Interlinear translation provides a word-for-word translation, often used to show how the original text breaks down. Literal translation sticks closely to the original text's wording and structure. Communicative translation focuses on conveying the meaning and effect of the original text in a way that is natural and understandable in the target language. Dynamic equivalence aims to produce a translation that has the same impact on the target audience as the original text had on its audience. The correct approach to conveying the communicative effect is often communicative translation. This method prioritizes making the translated text read smoothly and convey the same emotional and contextual impact as the source material. For example, translating a humorous phrase from one language to another in a way that preserves the humor for the new audience would be a case of communicative translation.
So what's interlinear translation?
Interlinear translation involves providing a word-for-word translation of a text, typically placed directly beneath the original text. This method shows the exact correspondence between the words or phrases in the source language and the target language. It's often used for linguistic analysis to understand how a sentence is constructed in different languages.
And what's literal translation?
Literal translation is the process of translating text word for word from one language to another, aiming to maintain the exact meaning of each word and phrase. This method focuses on staying as close as possible to the original language's structure and vocabulary, often resulting in translations that may sound unnatural or awkward in the target language.
So what's the difference between interlinear and literal translation?
The difference between interlinear and literal translation lies in their approach and purpose. Interlinear translation provides a word-for-word translation that is directly aligned with the source text, often placed directly beneath the original words. This method is used mainly for study purposes, allowing readers to see the exact word-for-word correspondence between the two languages, without concern for grammatical correctness or natural flow in the target language. Literal translation, on the other hand, also translates word for word, but with more attention to maintaining the grammatical structure of the target language. The goal is to stay as close to the original meaning as possible, while still producing a text that reads somewhat naturally in the target language, though it may still be awkward or unnatural. So while both focus on a word-for-word translation, interlinear translation is more focused on direct alignment with the source text for study purposes, whereas literal translation tries to make the translation more grammatically correct in the target language.
And what about dynamic equivalence?
Dynamic equivalence is a translation approach that focuses on conveying the overall meaning and intent of the source text, rather than sticking closely to the exact words or structure. The goal is to produce a translation that feels natural and resonates with the target audience, even if it means making changes to the wording, idioms, or cultural references. In essence, dynamic equivalence prioritizes the reader's understanding and experience over a strict word-for-word accuracy. It's about capturing the spirit and tone of the original text in a way that makes sense in the target language and culture.
Now the next question, multi word expressions. The correct match with the multi word expressions is phraseology. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Multi-word expressions are best matched with phraseology. Phraseology is the study of fixed or semi-fixed expressions in language, including idioms, collocations, and other types of multi-word units. These expressions often have meanings that can't be deduced just by understanding the individual words, which is why they're grouped under the study of phraseology.
Now, what about the next question? The entries in the dictionary are arranged according to the code that is accessible to all so that a dictionary can be consulted quickly and easily. This process of coding is called graphic form. Can you elaborate more on this?
The process of coding that arranges entries in a dictionary in a way that is accessible and allows quick and easy consultation is typically called alphabetical order rather than graphic form. In alphabetical order, entries are organized according to the sequence of letters in the alphabet, making it easier for users to find words. Graphic form, on the other hand, generally refers to the visual representation of words or symbols, such as how they are written or printed. So, in the context of dictionary entries, the coding process is about ensuring that words are arranged systematically, most commonly in alphabetical order, to facilitate quick access. Does that make sense?
Yes, it certainly does. Alright, let's move on to the.
Great, glad to hear that. Ready to move on to the next question?
Yeah, sure.
Alright, here's the next question. Question: what is the study of meaning in language called? Options: 1. Phonology, 2. Syntax, 3. Semantics or morphology. Which option?
Well, the next question is it talks about interpreter and I don't know, interpreter and okay, yeah, so interpreter. So, which of the following is not true? The first, an interpreter directly executes instructions written in a programming language without previously compiling them into a machine language program. The second, that an interpreter may parse the source code and perform its behavior directly. Third, that an interpreter may translate the source code into some efficient intermediate representation and immediately execute this. Fourth, that an interpreter may explicitly store the pre-compiled code made by a compiler, which is a part of the interpreter system. Now, what I want you to do is elaborate each point one by one. So you elaborate the first point, and then you give me time to, repeat that same thing, and then you move on to the explanation of the second point, and then you give me some time to repeat after you, and then you move on to the third one. So let's do that. Don't fuck this up. It's already fucked. All right. Uh, I don't wanna break this thing. Interpreter directly executes instructions. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. An interpreter does directly execute instructions, translating and running the code line by line. Would you like to discuss this further or move on to the next question?
Okay, so there are a few things about the interpreter. So the first is that, so there are 4 points about the interpreter written over here. Now I want you to elaborate each point that's mentioned over there, and then I want you to give me some time for repeating it after you.
Sure. I'll go over each point about the interpreter. 1. Direct execution. An interpreter directly executes instructions by translating them line by line as the program runs, rather than converting the entire code into machine language first. This allows for immediate execution, but can be slower than compiled programs, because each instruction is processed in real time. 2. Memory usage. Interpreters generally use less memory than compilers, since they don't need to generate an intermediate code or a machine code file. However, they can be less efficient in terms of speed, because the code is interpreted every time it's run. Debugging and testing. Since interpreters execute code line by line, they are useful for debugging. You can test parts of the code and see results immediately, which makes finding and fixing errors easier during development. 4. Platform independence. Interpreted languages often have the advantage of being platform independent. As long as the interpreter is available for a specific platform, the code can be run without modification. This contrasts with compiled languages, where the compiled code is usually specific to the platform it was compiled on. Take your time to review this, and let me know when you're ready to continue.
Alright, let's go over each point one more time, and then so what I want you to do is elaborate one point and then give me some time to repeat it after you, and then you move on to the second, the elaboration of the second point, and then you give me some time to repeat after you, and then you move on to the third one. So let's do that.
Sure. Let's start with the first point. Direct execution. An interpreter directly executes instructions by translating them line by line as the program runs, rather than converting the entire code into machine language first. This allows for immediate execution, but can be slower than compiled programs because each instruction is processed in real time. Take a moment to repeat that, and then we'll move on to the next point.
This was too elaborate for me to repeat it after you, but I'll try. So, an interpreter directly executes the instructions that are written in a programming language, and it does not convert that into a machine language program. Probably.
you're on the right track. The key idea is that an interpreter processes instructions one at a time, executing them directly as it goes, rather than first converting the entire program into machine language. Ready for the next point?
Yeah.
The second point is that an interpreter does not produce an intermediate object code. Instead, it executes the code directly. This means it doesn't create a separate file or code that represents the compiled program, but runs the program directly from the source code.
The interpreter does not create an intermediate execution code, but rather runs the program directly, probably, I guess.
That's correct. The interpreter executes the code directly without generating a separate intermediate code or file.
Yeah, let's move on to the third one.
The interpreter reads and executes instructions one at a time. This means it processes each line or statement of the program sequentially, without waiting to read the entire program first.
So an interpreter processes each statement one at a time without before moving on to the next
Yes,
one.
that's correct. An interpreter processes each statement or instruction one at a time, executing them immediately without waiting to compile the entire program first.
And then the following are the statements about the interpreter which I need you to elaborate on. Now, an interpreter may translate the source code into some efficient intermediate representation and immediately execute this.
An interpreter might translate the source code into an intermediate representation that's more efficient for execution. This intermediate form is not a complete machine code program, but is used to speed up execution by simplifying or optimizing the code. The interpreter then runs this representation directly, which can improve performance compared to interpreting raw source code.
Okay, now an interpreter may parse the source code and perform its behavior directly.
An interpreter may analyze the source code and correctly execute the instructions it describes. Parsing involves breaking down the code into manageable components to understand its structure and meaning. The interpreter then performs the specified operations immediately without creating a separate executable file or machine code. This approach allows for immediate feedback and execution, but can be slower compared to precompiled code.
So an interpreter may grab or get hold of the gist of the source code and immediately execute this thing, as far as I understand.
Yes, that's right. An interpreter breaks down and understands the source code, then executes the instructions right away without creating a separate machine code file. This immediate execution allows for quick testing and debugging.
Now, an interpreter may explicitly store the pre-compiled code made by a compiler, which is a part of the interpreter system.
An interpreter might save pre-compiled code created by a compiler as part of its system. This means it can use pre-processed code to speed up execution, but it still interprets the code at runtime, rather than translating it all at once into machine language.
So it pre-compiles the codes at runtime, and it stores the pre-compiled code to enhance execution.
interpreter can pre-compile code to make execution faster and store this pre-compiled code for later use, improving performance while still interpreting the code during execution.
And what about the latter part of the statement that I mentioned?
The latter part of the statement indicates that this pre-compiled code becomes part of the interpreter's system. This means the interpreter keeps this code within its environment, using it to speed up future executions.
Okay, so the pre-compiled code is done by the compiler, and so
Yes, that's right. The pre-compiled code is generated by a compiler, and the interpreter stores it as part of its